Have you ever noticed how some of the biggest differences in life seem to come from the smallest things? When people look at Japan, they often notice the obvious results. People tend to live long lives. Public spaces are remarkably clean. Daily routines often seem organized. There is a certain calmness, discipline, and attention to detail that shows up in everything from a train platform to a small neighborhood kitchen. And it's tempting to look at all of that and think there must be some secret. There isn't. At least, not one single secret. Japan is a complicated country, just like anywhere else. People work long hours. They deal with stress. They raise families, pay bills, get tired, make mistakes, and have bad days. Life isn't magically easier there, and that's exactly what makes these habits worth paying attention to. Because the lesson isn't that Japanese people somehow avoid the problems the rest of us have. It's that many ordinary moments are handled a little differently. A meal is approached with a little more awareness. A shared space is treated with a little more consideration. Improvement is approached in smaller steps. Rest is given a little more intention. Imperfection isn't always treated as something that needs to be hidden. None of these things looks dramatic when you see them once. But repeat a small behavior for 10 years, 20 years, or an entire lifetime, and it stops being small. It becomes a way of living. That's what we're going to look at today. 8 tiny Japanese habits and ideas that can quietly influence the way you work, eat, rest, deal with difficulty, treat other people, and even think about your own imperfections. And I want to make one thing clear before we start. This isn't about trying to become Japanese, and it isn't about pretending that everything Japan does is better. That's not the point. The useful question is much simpler. What principles can we learn from another culture and adapt to our own lives? Because a good idea doesn't have to stay in the country where it started. If it helps you live with a little more intention, a little less friction, or a little more peace, it's worth understanding. And these habits are surprisingly practical. I'm not going to ask you to wake up at 4 in the morning. You don't need to meditate for 2 hours. You don't need a perfect morning routine. And you definitely don't need to rebuild your entire life this weekend. In fact, most of what we're about to talk about is almost ridiculously small. One tiny improvement, one pause during a meal, 10 quiet minutes outside, one moment of patience before you react. One thoughtful action that makes somebody else's day a little easier. That's it. But here's something I've learned over the years. The changes that last are rarely the ones that feel dramatic in the beginning. They're usually the ones that are easy enough to repeat when you're tired, busy, distracted, or simply not feeling motivated. That's why small habits matter. They don't demand a completely different version of you. They slowly create one. None of the habits in this video will change your life tonight. But if you practice them consistently, they may change who you become over the next few years. And as we go through each one, I'll show you what it means, why it matters, what it can look like in ordinary life, and one very small way you can try it for yourself. You don't need to use all 8. In fact, I wouldn't recommend trying. Just pay attention to the one that makes you think, that's probably what I need right now. Start there. Because the first Japanese idea we're going to explore is built around exactly that principle. Real improvement doesn't always begin with a huge decision. Sometimes it begins with something so small you almost don't notice it, and that idea is called Kaizen. The first habit is Kaizen. And if you've ever tried to change your life by changing everything at once, this idea might feel almost too simple. Kaizen means continuous improvement, but not the kind of improvement where you wake up on January 1st and decide you're suddenly going to exercise every day, eat perfectly, read 50 books, wake up at 5 in the morning, and somehow become a completely different person by February. We've all seen how that usually ends. You start strong. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, motivation carries you. Then life gets busy. You miss one workout. You order takeout. You skip the morning routine. And suddenly, the whole plan feels broken. Kaizen takes almost the opposite approach. Instead of asking, "How can I completely change my life?" it asks, "What's one small thing I can make a little better today?" That's it, not 20 things. One. And sometimes the improvement is so small that it almost feels pointless. But that's exactly why it works. One of the best-known examples comes from Japanese manufacturing. Toyota became famous for building a culture where improvement wasn't only the responsibility of executives or engineers. Workers throughout the production process were encouraged to notice small problems and small opportunities. Maybe a tool could be placed closer to where it was used. Maybe a worker was taking an unnecessary step. Maybe a process could be made slightly faster. Maybe something that caused confusion could be simplified. None of those changes sounds revolutionary, and individually, they aren't. But imagine making hundreds, then thousands, of tiny improvements over years. Eventually, the system you're using today barely resembles the one you started with. That's the part people often miss about Kaizen. The power isn't in the size of one improvement. It's in the number of times you improve. And the same idea works surprisingly well outside a factory. Let's say you want to get stronger. Most people start by creating a workout plan that's much bigger than their current habit. An hour at the gym, 5 days a week, new diet, new schedule, new clothes, new everything. But if you're currently exercising 0 days a week, going from 0 to 5 is a huge jump. Kaizen would ask you to make the first step almost embarrassingly easy. Do one push-up. Just one. Now, one push-up isn't going to transform your body. That's not the point. The point is that it's difficult to tell yourself you don't have time for one push-up. And once you're already on the floor, maybe you do 5. Maybe tomorrow you do 6. But even if you only do 1, you've reinforced something more important than the workout itself. You've become the kind of person who showed up today. Reading works the same way. Don't begin by telling yourself you're going to read an hour every night. Read 1 page. 1 page feels almost too easy to matter, but 1 page becomes 2. 2 becomes 10. And over time, something that once required discipline starts becoming part of your normal day. But there's another side to Kaizen that I think is even more useful. It's not only about making the action smaller, it's about making the action easier. A lot of us assume that when we fail to build a habit, we simply need more discipline. Sometimes that's true, but often, the environment around the habit is working against us. Think about reading. If the book you want to read is buried on a shelf in another room, and your phone is sitting 6 inches from your hand, which one are you more likely to reach for? Probably the phone. So instead of fighting yourself every night, change the environment. Put the book on your pillow in the morning. Now, when you go to bed, you have to pick it up before you can even lie down. That's Kaizen too. If you want to exercise in the morning, put your workout clothes beside the bed the night before. If you want to drink more water, don't keep the bottle hidden in the kitchen. Put it where you work. If there's something you use 10 times a day, don't store it somewhere that makes you take 5 extra steps every time you need it. Move it closer. That's what I love about this idea. Kaizen is not only about doing more. Sometimes improvement means removing one unnecessary step, and that changes the way you think about discipline. Instead of constantly asking, "Why can't I force myself to do this?" you start asking, "Why is this harder than it needs to be?" That's a much more useful question. Because the truth is, willpower is unreliable. Some mornings you'll feel motivated. Some mornings you won't. Some evenings you'll have energy, other evenings you'll be exhausted. A good system shouldn't only work on your best day, it should still be easy enough to use on your average day. That's why one of the smartest things you can do is make the good habit easier before trying to make yourself more disciplined. Look around your life. What do you keep saying you want to do? Read more? Exercise? Drink more water? Keep your home organized? Cook more often? Learn something new? Now, don't ask yourself how you can become more motivated. Ask something smaller. What is one daily action I could make 10% easier today? Maybe you put the fruit where you can actually see it. Maybe you leave your walking shoes by the door. Maybe you move the trash can closer to the place where clutter usually collects. Maybe you prepare tomorrow's breakfast before going to bed. Maybe you remove one unnecessary step from something you do every morning. None of this feels dramatic. That's the point. Real change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like moving a pair of shoes, reading one page, doing one push-up, putting a glass of water on the desk, small enough to ignore, small enough to repeat, and repeated long enough, small improvements stop being small. They become your environment, then your routine, and eventually, part of who you are. Kaizen answers one important question. How do I improve without burning myself out? Start smaller than your ambition wants you to. Make the next step easier. Then repeat it. But improvement alone isn't enough. You can become more efficient, more disciplined, and more productive, and still wake up wondering what all that effort is actually for. So the next Japanese idea asks a deeper question. Not, how should I improve? But, why do I want to keep going at all? And that brings us to Ikigai. The second idea is Ikigai. And this one goes a little deeper than productivity. Because once you start improving your life, sooner or later, you run into a bigger question. What are you improving it for? You can become more organized, more efficient, healthier, more disciplined. But if your days still feel empty, none of that feels like enough. That's where Ikigai comes in. Ikigai is often translated as a reason for being, a reason to get up in the morning, something that gives your life a sense of meaning. And when people hear the word purpose, they often imagine something enormous, a dream career, a major achievement, a business, a mission, something impressive enough to explain at a dinner party. But Ikigai doesn't have to look like that. In fact, it can be surprisingly small. For one person, it might be tending a garden every morning. For someone else, it's teaching a skill they've spent years learning. It could be making something with your hands, caring for your family, preparing breakfast for someone you love, walking your dog before the neighborhood wakes up, practicing an instrument, meeting the same friend for coffee every Thursday, getting a little better at something simply because you enjoy getting better at it. None of those things sounds world-changing, but that's exactly the point. A meaningful life doesn't have to look impressive from the outside. It just has to feel meaningful from the inside. This idea is often discussed in connection with Okinawa, where researchers have long been interested in the large number of people who have lived to advanced ages. Of course, there isn't one simple reason for longevity. Diet matters, movement matters, social connection matters, environment matters, genetics matter, and purpose may be one piece of that larger picture. But even without turning Ikigai into a medical explanation, the idea is worth paying attention to, because people tend to do better when they feel needed, when there is someone to care for, something to finish, something to look forward to, something that gives tomorrow a little shape. I think this is where a lot of modern advice about purpose becomes unnecessarily complicated. We're often told to find your passion, find your calling, discover what you were born to do, and that can create a strange kind of pressure. Because what happens if you don't know? What happens if you're 45 and still don't have one grand mission? What happens if your job pays the bills, but it isn't the thing that makes you feel most alive? Does that mean you're doing life wrong? Of course not. Your ikigai doesn't have to be your career. It doesn't have to make money. It doesn't have to become a personal brand. And it doesn't have to impress anyone. Sometimes the thing that gives your life meaning is so ordinary that you almost overlook it. Maybe it's calling your mother every Sunday. Maybe it's watching your tomatoes grow. Maybe it's cooking dinner for your kids. Maybe it's fixing old furniture in the garage. Maybe it's becoming the person younger coworkers come to when they need advice. Maybe it's learning a language, one lesson at a time. Maybe it's simply knowing that somebody is happier because you're here. That matters, more than we sometimes realize. And here's something worth noticing. Purpose doesn't always arrive as one dramatic revelation. Sometimes you build it through repetition. You care for something long enough that it becomes meaningful. You practice something long enough that it becomes part of your identity. You show up for someone often enough that the relationship becomes one of the reasons your life feels full. Meaning can grow. It doesn't always have to be discovered. That's why I wouldn't start with the enormous question, what is my life mission? That's too big for most Tuesday mornings. Try something smaller. Ask yourself, what is one thing that makes tomorrow worth waking up for? Maybe you already know the answer. Maybe you don't. If you don't, that's fine. Look at the moments when you lose track of time. Notice what you enjoy doing even when nobody is watching. Notice who you naturally want to help. Notice the things you would miss if they disappeared from your life. Those clues matter. And maybe your answer changes over time. That's normal too. The thing that gave your life meaning at 25 may not be the same thing that gives it meaning at 65. Purpose isn't a contract. It can evolve with you. And I think that's one of the most comforting parts of Ikigai. You don't have to solve your entire life. You just need something that makes the next day worth entering. Your reason for living doesn't have to impress anyone. It only has to make tomorrow matter to you. So sometime today, take a minute and ask yourself that question. Not, what should I accomplish before I die? Not, what should my career become? Just, what is one thing I'm genuinely glad will still be there tomorrow? Protect that. Make time for it. Let it become part of your life instead of something you keep postponing until you're less busy. Because having something to live for matters. But there is another side to a meaningful life that modern culture doesn't talk about nearly enough. We spend a lot of time learning how to want more. More money, more food, more possessions, more achievement, more everything. But very few of us are taught how to recognize the moment when we already have enough. The next Japanese habit begins right there, and it's called Hara Hachi Bu. The third habit is Hara Hachi Bu. And on the surface, this one sounds like it's only about food. But I think it's really about something much bigger. It's about learning how to recognize when you've had enough. Hara Hachi Bu is a phrase associated with Okinawan eating culture. It's often explained as eating until you're about 80% full. But I wouldn't treat that number like a scientific measurement. Nobody is sitting at the dinner table calculating whether they're exactly 79 or 81% full. That's not really the useful part of the idea. The useful part is the pause. It's the moment when you stop eating long enough to notice what your body is actually telling you. Because most of us don't eat that way anymore. We eat while watching television. We eat while checking email. We eat while scrolling through our phones. We eat quickly because lunch is short. We keep eating because the plate isn't empty. And sometimes, if we're being honest, we keep eating simply because the food still tastes good. None of that makes you a bad person. It just means eating has become automatic. And when something becomes automatic, it's very easy to stop paying attention. Hara Hachi Bu introduces a tiny interruption into that automatic behavior, a moment to ask, do I actually need more? That's a very different question from, is there still food left? Your plate doesn't know whether you're hungry. The restaurant portion doesn't know what your body needs today. And the amount you ate yesterday doesn't necessarily tell you how much you need tonight. That's why slowing down matters. Your body has signals that tell you when you're becoming satisfied. But if you're eating fast, distracted, or simply following the size of the portion in front of you, it's easy to move past those signals before you notice them. So, instead of thinking, I need to eat 20% less, try something simpler. Create one pause. The next time you eat, don't change your entire meal. Don't count every bite. Don't turn dinner into another stressful health project. Just eat normally. Then, about halfway through the meal, stop for a moment. Put your fork or chopsticks down, take a few slow breaths, and ask yourself, am I still hungry, or am I simply continuing because food is still here? Sometimes the answer will be, I'm still hungry. Then keep eating. There's nothing wrong with that. Other times you may realize, I'm actually fine. I'm just eating because I haven't finished yet. That awareness is the habit, not restriction. Awareness. And there's another small thing you can try. Pay attention to the first few bites. Most people enjoy the beginning of a meal more than they realize. You're hungry. The flavors are strong. Your attention is naturally on the food. Then something changes. A few minutes later, you're eating faster. Maybe you're thinking about work. Maybe you're reading something on your phone. Maybe the food has become background noise. So slow down at the beginning. Actually taste the first bite. Notice the temperature, the texture, the smell. Give your brain a chance to realize, I'm eating now. It sounds almost too simple. But that's the point of these habits. Small moments of attention can change behaviors that usually happen without thought. And if you can, try one meal without scrolling. Not every meal. You don't need another rule to fail at. Just one. Put the phone somewhere you can't reach without making a conscious decision. Eat. Talk to the person you're with. Or if you're eating alone, just let the meal be the meal. You'll probably notice something interesting. Food feels different when it gets your full attention. You may eat more slowly. You may notice when you're satisfied earlier. And you may enjoy the meal more, even though you're doing less at the same time. But here's where Hara Hachi Bu becomes more interesting to me. Because the principle doesn't have to stop at the dinner table. We live in a culture that constantly tells us that more is better. More food, more money, more storage, more clothes, more entertainment, more achievements, more productivity, more options, more information. Even when we have enough, we're trained to ask, what else can I add? And sometimes the better question is, what if this is already enough? That's a very different way of looking at life. Think about your home. How many things do you keep buying because a little more storage seems easier than deciding what you actually need? Think about work. How often do you add one more task to the day even though the important work is already finished? Think about entertainment. You finish one episode, and the next one starts automatically. You finish one video, and another appears. You read one piece of news, then another, then another. There's rarely a natural stopping point anymore. Everything around us is designed to continue, so learning to stop has become a skill. And that's why I think Hara Hachi Bu is more useful than simply saying, eat less. The real lesson is learning to notice the difference between hunger and habit, between need and momentum, between enjoying something and simply continuing because nothing told you to stop. The real habit isn't eating less. It's learning to recognize enough. And that's not always easy. Sometimes enough feels uncomfortable because we're so used to maximizing everything. We think if there's still room on the plate, we should fill it. If there's still time in the day, we should use it. If there's still money available, maybe we should spend it. If there's still space in the house, maybe we should put something there. But empty space isn't always a problem. Stopping isn't always missing out. And leaving something unfinished doesn't always mean you've failed. Sometimes it simply means you notice the moment when more stopped adding value. So here's a small challenge. At your next meal, don't try to become a completely different eater. Just create one pause. Halfway through, put the utensils down. Take a breath. Ask yourself, am I still hungry or am I just continuing? Then listen to the answer. That's it. You may finish the whole meal. You may leave a little behind. Either way, the goal isn't to win. The goal is to notice. Because once you learn to recognize enough with food, you may start recognizing it in other parts of your life too. And that can be surprisingly freeing. You don't always need more. Sometimes you need space. Sometimes you need quiet. And sometimes what you need most isn't another hour of productivity, another purchase, another piece of information, or another thing to consume. Sometimes what you need is recovery, which brings us to the next Japanese practice, Shinrin-yoku. The simple idea of stepping away from constant stimulation and letting your attention rest in nature. The fourth practice is Shinrin-yoku. You may have heard it translated as forest bathing. And no, it doesn't mean taking a bath in the woods. It simply means spending slow, intentional time in nature, not hiking for a personal record, not trying to burn calories, not turning the walk into another task to complete. The point is to be there, to notice, to let your senses wake up a little. That may sound almost too simple, but think about how most of us spend a normal day. You wake up and check your phone. You answer messages. You move between emails, notifications, conversations, videos, meetings, and whatever else is demanding your attention. Even when you're resting, you're often still consuming something: a podcast, a show, a news feed, a playlist, another video. Your body may be sitting still, but your attention rarely is. And I think that's one reason so many people feel tired, even on days when they haven't done much physically. Sometimes the exhaustion isn't coming from movement. It's coming from switching. One thing to another, then another, then another. Your attention keeps getting pulled in different directions all day long. And there is almost never a moment when nothing is asking something from you. That's where Shinrin-yoku becomes interesting. Because in nature, especially when you remove the phone for a while, your attention works differently. You don't have to respond to the tree. The sky isn't asking you to click anything. The wind doesn't need an answer. A bird doesn't send you a notification. You can simply notice what is there. And that kind of attention feels very different from the attention we use online. Shinrin-yoku became widely known in Japan as a way of spending restorative time in forest environments. Research has explored whether time in nature may support relaxation and help reduce stress, but I wouldn't turn it into some miracle cure. You don't need to believe that one walk in the woods will fix your health. The more practical lesson is simpler. Human beings seem to benefit from moments when the environment stops demanding constant decisions and constant responses. And here's the good news. You do not need to live next to a cedar forest in Japan. You don't need a mountain. You don't need expensive hiking equipment. You don't even need an entire afternoon. A local park can work. A tree-lined street can work. A quiet garden can work. Even a small patch of green near your home can become a place where your attention gets a break. What matters is how you use the time. Here's a simple version you can try. I call it a 10-minute urban nature reset. For 10 minutes, put the phone away. Not in your hand, not open to a fitness app. Not playing a podcast in your pocket, just away. Then walk slowly. And I mean slowly. You're not trying to get somewhere. You're not trying to hit 10,000 steps. You're not timing your pace. You're simply giving yourself 10 minutes when there is no performance target. Start by noticing 5 things you can see. Maybe it's sunlight moving through leaves, a shadow on the sidewalk, the shape of a branch, clouds moving across the sky, the way grass grows through a crack in the pavement. Then notice 3 sounds. Maybe traffic is still there. That's fine. But perhaps underneath it, you can hear birds, wind, leaves moving, someone walking in the distance. Then notice the air. Is it warm? Cool? Dry? Humid? Can you feel it moving across your face or your hands? You don't have to analyze any of this. You don't have to name every tree. You don't have to be good at being in nature. Just notice. That's enough. And if your mind starts wandering back to work, bills, errands, or something somebody said yesterday, that's normal. You don't need to fight the thought. Notice it. Then bring your attention back to something physical around you. The color of a leaf, the movement of light, the feeling of the ground under your feet. That's the practice. And this is where people sometimes misunderstand Shinrin-yoku. They think the goal is to go farther, find a better trail, spend more time, travel somewhere beautiful. But the point is not distance. The goal isn't to cover distance. The goal is to recover attention. That's a very different kind of walk. A normal walk can become another achievement. How far did I go? How fast? How many calories did I burn? Did I beat yesterday? And there's nothing wrong with that. Exercise is good. Goals can be useful. But sometimes turning every activity into a measurement creates the very thing we're trying to escape: pressure. So for 10 minutes, don't optimize the walk. Let the walk be useless in the best possible way. You're not producing anything. You're not learning anything. You're not getting ahead. You're just paying attention to where you actually are. And I think a lot of us need more moments like that, because modern fatigue isn't always about doing too much. Sometimes it's about processing too much. Too many tabs open, too many voices, too many decisions, too many small interruptions. Even a notification that takes 5 seconds can leave part of your mind somewhere else for much longer. Then another one arrives, and another. By the end of the day, your mind can feel like a room where 10 different conversations are happening at the same time. Nature doesn't necessarily solve those problems, but it can give your attention somewhere quieter to land. And sometimes that's enough to help you return to the rest of your life a little differently. Maybe calmer, maybe less reactive, maybe simply more aware of how overstimulated you had become. So here's the challenge for this week. Take one 10-minute walk without consuming anything. No podcast, no music, no phone scrolling, no voice messages, no need to turn it into content. Just 10 minutes. Walk slowly. Notice what you see. Notice what you hear. Notice the air. And see what happens when your mind isn't being fed something every second. You may feel relaxed. You may feel restless. You may realize how strong the urge to reach for your phone has become. All of those reactions are useful information. Because Shinrin-yoku isn't really asking you to escape your life. It's asking you to return to your senses for a little while. And once the noise becomes quieter, something else often becomes easier to notice. The pressure we put on ourselves to improve everything, fix everything, make everything look right, make every part of life feel complete. And that's where the next Japanese idea, offers a very different way of seeing things. Instead of asking, "How do I make this perfect?" it asks, "What if this doesn't need to be perfect at all?" That idea is called Wabi-sabi. The fifth idea is Wabi-sabi, and this one is less about what you do and more about how you see. Wabi-sabi is often described as an appreciation for imperfection, simplicity, impermanence, and the marks that time leaves behind. In other words, it asks us to notice beauty in things that are not flawless. A wooden table with scratches, a ceramic bowl with signs of age, a faded fabric, a room that feels lived in instead of staged, a face with wrinkles, a garden that isn't perfectly symmetrical. None of these things are perfect, but they may still be beautiful. Maybe even more beautiful because they carry evidence of time. And that's a very different message from the one many of us hear every day. Modern life constantly shows us polished versions of everything. Perfect homes, perfect bodies, perfect kitchens, perfect vacations, perfect morning routines. Even ordinary life is often edited until it no longer looks ordinary. And after seeing enough of that, something strange happens. We stop comparing our lives to real life. We start comparing them to presentations of life. Your kitchen isn't compared to your neighbor's kitchen anymore. It's compared to a professionally lit kitchen that was cleaned, styled, photographed, edited, and then posted online. Your body isn't compared to the body of another ordinary person. It's compared to an image taken from the best angle, under the best lighting, on the best day. Your work isn't compared to someone's first attempt. It's compared to the finished version they decided to show you. And if you live inside that comparison long enough, almost everything begins to feel slightly inadequate. The house could be cleaner, the face could look younger, the project could be better, the furniture could be newer, you could be further ahead. Wabi-sabi interrupts that way of thinking. It reminds us that not everything needs to look untouched in order to have value. Old wood can still be beautiful. A worn chair can still be comfortable. A scratched table can still hold a family dinner. Wrinkles can be signs of years that were actually lived. A home can be warm and peaceful without looking like a furniture catalog. And this is where I think wabi-sabi becomes much more useful than simply saying, "Imperfection is beautiful," because that sounds nice. But life requires more judgment than that. Some things really do need to be fixed. If the roof is leaking, fix the roof. If a relationship is unhealthy, don't romanticize the damage. If a habit is hurting your health or your future, acceptance is not an excuse to avoid changing it. Wabi-sabi does not mean neglect. It does not mean giving up. And it doesn't mean pretending every flaw is wonderful. The deeper lesson is learning to tell the difference between two very different things. Something that genuinely needs repair, and something that simply doesn't need to be perfect. That distinction can save you a surprising amount of energy. Think about your home. Maybe there are scratches on the dining table from years of use. Do they stop the table from doing its job? Probably not. Maybe your living room doesn't look like a showroom. But does it feel comfortable? Can people relax there? Does it support the life you're actually living? Then maybe the goal doesn't need to be perfection. Maybe the goal is simply that the space works well and feels good to live in. The same thing applies to work. A lot of people keep polishing a project long after the important work is finished. One more edit, one more adjustment, one more tiny detail. Not because the project is bad, but because releasing something imperfect feels uncomfortable. Wabi-sabi offers another question. Is the project actually unfinished? Or are you trying to remove every trace that a human being made it? Sometimes good enough to share is better than perfect but never finished. And the same principle applies when you're learning something new. People often wait until they feel ready before they begin, ready to speak a language, ready to cook, ready to start exercising, ready to create, ready to change careers. But the truth is, most beginnings are awkward. Your first attempt is supposed to look like a first attempt. You don't need to remove every imperfection before you're allowed to continue. Sometimes you learn by letting the imperfect version exist. That's part of becoming better. And here's something I've noticed. Perfectionism often disguises itself as high standards, but they're not always the same thing. High standards can help you do meaningful work, Tom. Perfectionism can keep you from finishing it. High standards say, let's make this better. Perfectionism says, if this isn't flawless, it isn't good enough. Those two voices may sound similar at first, but they lead to very different lives. One encourages improvement. The other can create endless dissatisfaction. And that's why this question is worth remembering. The next time you notice something imperfect, pause before immediately trying to fix it. Ask yourself, does this actually need fixing, or does it simply not need to be perfect? Maybe the answer is, yes, this needs attention. Then fix it. But maybe the answer is, no, this is simply part of life. Then perhaps you can let it be. The scratch, the uneven edge, the wrinkle, the room that looks lived in, the mistake you've already learned from, the skill you're still developing. The version of yourself that is still becoming something. You don't have to celebrate every imperfection, but you also don't have to fight every one. That constant fight is exhausting. And sometimes the peaceful choice is not to improve another thing. It's to recognize that nothing is actually wrong. Peace often begins when improvement stops being confused with perfection. I think that's one reason Wabi-sabi feels so relevant now. We're surrounded by tools that make it easier than ever to edit reality. We can smooth skin, remove objects from photographs, clean up backgrounds, rewrite sentences, filter faces, curate homes, present only the best moments. And there is nothing inherently wrong with any of that. But if everything we see is polished, we can begin to forget what real life looks like. Real life has wear. It has unfinished corners. It has things that age. It has things that change. And so do we. There is a certain freedom in allowing something to be complete without being perfect. A meal that tasted good even though the presentation wasn't beautiful. A room that is clean enough. A project that does what it needs to do. A body that has carried you through decades of life. A day that wasn't extraordinary, but was still a good day. Those things count. So here's a small practice. Today, notice one thing you normally criticize because it isn't perfect. Don't immediately change it. Look at it for a moment. Then ask, does this need repair? Or does it need acceptance? Learning that difference can change the way you see your home, your work, and eventually yourself. But acceptance only takes us so far. Some parts of life aren't simply imperfect, they're painful. There are seasons when something goes wrong, and you cannot make it beautiful just by changing your perspective. You lose something, you fail, you get disappointed. Life becomes genuinely difficult. And when acceptance isn't enough, another Japanese idea becomes important. Not the ability to pretend everything is fine, but the ability to keep your dignity when everything is not fine. That idea is called Gaman. The sixth idea is Gaman, and this one is easy to misunderstand. Gaman is often described as enduring difficulty with patience, dignity, and self-control. It is the ability to go through something hard without letting the hardship completely take over the way you think, speak, and act. At first, that can sound like just suffer quietly, or don't complain, or even hide what you're feeling. But that is not the most useful way to understand it. Gaman is not about pretending pain doesn't exist. It's not about becoming emotionally numb. And it certainly doesn't mean staying in a harmful situation just to prove that you're strong. The deeper idea is this: you may not control what happened, but you can still choose how you respond to what happened. That sounds simple. It isn't. Most of us know what it's like to react too quickly. Someone says something disrespectful. You send the message immediately. Something goes wrong at work. You start complaining before you even understand the problem. You get bad news. Your mind immediately jumps to the worst possible outcome. You feel angry, embarrassed, afraid, or disappointed. And for a few minutes, the emotion becomes the person making every decision. Gaman creates a little space between the feeling and the response. Not because the feeling is wrong, but because feelings are not always good decision makers. Anger can tell you something matters. Fear can warn you that something feels unsafe. Sadness can tell you that you've lost something important. Those emotions are real. They deserve to be acknowledged. But acknowledging an emotion is different from handing it control. That's where quiet resilience begins. Imagine someone criticizes you at work. Your first reaction may be defensive. You want to explain, push back, prove them wrong. Maybe they're being unfair. Maybe you're embarrassed. Gaman doesn't tell you to smile and pretend you don't care. It asks you to pause long enough to decide what kind of response will actually help. Maybe you need to clarify something calmly. Maybe you need to admit a mistake. Maybe you need to wait until you're less angry before answering. Maybe the criticism is unfair, and you need to address it clearly. The point is not silence. The point is choice. And I think that difference matters, because reacting immediately often feels powerful in the moment. But later, we end up dealing with two problems: the original problem and the damage caused by our reaction. A harsh message. A conversation that escalated, words we can't take back. A decision made while we were angry. Sometimes strength is not saying the first thing that comes into your head. Sometimes strength is giving yourself 10 minutes before you answer. But there is an important boundary here. Gaman does not mean suppressing every emotion or refusing help. You do not need to stay in a harmful relationship and call it endurance. You do not need to tolerate abuse to prove that you're strong. You do not need to pretend that anxiety, grief, exhaustion, or pain aren't real. And you do not need to solve every difficult situation by yourself. A resilient person can ask for help. In fact, sometimes asking for help is the most responsible action available. There is a big difference between complaining without action and seeking useful support. Complaining without action often keeps us trapped in the same story. This always happens to me. Nothing ever works. Everyone is against me. And if we repeat that story long enough, eventually it becomes the only thing we can see. Seeking support is different. It sounds like, "I'm struggling with this. Can you help me think through what to do next?" Or, "I don't know how to solve this. Who has experience with it?" Or simply, "I'm not doing well right now, and I need someone to talk to." That's not weakness. That's information followed by action. And that's one of the most important distinctions in Gaman. Endurance doesn't mean doing nothing. It means staying steady enough to choose the next useful step. I think of it this way. If you're standing in heavy rain, Gaman isn't pretending you're dry. It's noticing that you're wet, accepting that the rain is here, and deciding what to do next. Find shelter. Keep walking. Ask someone for an umbrella. Wait for the storm to pass. But don't spend the entire time shouting at the sky. That's where your energy matters. And life gives us plenty of chances to practice this. Traffic. A delayed flight. A difficult coworker, a broken appliance, a mistake, a rude comment, a plan that suddenly falls apart. Not every problem deserves the same amount of emotional energy. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is say, "This is frustrating," and then ask, "What is actually within my control?" That question can change the direction of a bad moment. Because usually there are two categories: things you can influence and things you can't. You may not control the weather, but you control whether you bring an umbrella. You may not control someone's personality, but you control how much access you give them to your attention. You may not control the mistake that already happened, but you control what you do next. You may not control whether someone misunderstands you, but you can decide whether the misunderstanding needs to be clarified. This doesn't make life easy. It makes your energy more deliberate. And that's a skill. So the next time something frustrating happens, try this before reacting. First, wait. Even 30 seconds can help. Second, name what you're feeling. I'm angry. I'm embarrassed. I'm disappointed. I'm nervous. Don't judge it. Just name it. Then ask, what part of this is actually within my control? And finally, what is the next useful action? Not the perfect action, not the action that fixes everything, just the next useful one. Maybe it's making a phone call. Maybe it's apologizing. Maybe it's gathering more information. Maybe it's walking away for an hour. Maybe it's asking for help. Maybe it's doing nothing until you have enough information to decide. That's Gaman in ordinary life. Not dramatic suffering, not emotional suppression, just the ability to keep a difficult moment from controlling the entire day. And sometimes that's much harder than it sounds, because emotions can feel urgent. When you're angry, responding now feels necessary. When you're afraid, solving everything immediately feels necessary. When you're hurt, making sure the other person understands your pain feels necessary. But urgency and importance are not always the same thing. Sometimes the best response becomes visible only after the emotional temperature comes down. Gaman doesn't mean feeling nothing. It means not allowing every feeling to make the decision for you. And that can create a kind of quiet strength. Not the kind people applaud, the kind nobody may even notice. You don't send the angry message. You admit the mistake instead of defending it. You keep showing up during a difficult season. You ask for support before things get worse. You focus on what you can actually do, small choices, but they change the way hardship moves through your life, because difficulty is unavoidable. But adding unnecessary damage to difficulty is not. And there is another reason this kind of self-control matters. Our reactions don't only affect us, they affect everyone around us. The way you speak when you're stressed, the way you use shared space, the way you make other people wait, the way your habits create either ease or inconvenience for somebody else. Gaman teaches us how to carry ourselves when life is difficult. The next Japanese idea asks us to look beyond ourselves and notice the experience of the people around us, not simply to be polite, but to think ahead, to notice what someone may need before they have to ask. That idea is called Omoiyari. The seventh idea is Omoiyari. And this one is less about being polite and more about paying attention. Omoiyari is often described as thoughtful consideration for other people. It means thinking about how your actions affect someone else, not after they complain, not after they ask, before. That is the part that makes it different from ordinary kindness. Kindness often responds to a need. Omoiyari tries to notice the need before it becomes a problem. You can see this idea in many ordinary parts of public life in Japan. People often speak quietly on trains. They clean up after themselves in shared spaces. They try not to block entrances. They return things where they belong. They pay attention to whether their behavior is creating inconvenience for the people around them. None of these things is dramatic. Nobody receives an award for standing slightly to the side so another person can pass. Nobody gets praised for cleaning a table after using it. Most of the time, nobody even notices. And that's exactly why I think Omoiyari is so interesting. A lot of good behavior is invisible. It works because the problem never happens. Think about your own home. You walk into the bathroom and discover the toilet paper roll is empty. Someone used the last sheet and walked away. It's a tiny inconvenience. Nothing serious happened. But now someone else has to fix what the previous person could have handled in 10 seconds. Omoiyari is replacing the roll before you leave. Not because there is a rule on the wall, not because somebody told you to, but because you know another person will come after you. The same idea applies in the kitchen. You cook something. You use the cutting board. You leave a few crumbs on the counter. You put a pan in the sink. Again, none of it seems like a big deal. But now the next person enters a space that already contains your unfinished work. Omoiyari asks a different question. What condition am I leaving this space in for the next person? So you wipe the counter, wash the pan, put the knife back, not because you're trying to create a perfect kitchen, but because you're reducing friction for whoever comes next. And once you start seeing Omoiyari this way, you begin noticing it everywhere. At work, it might mean giving a file a clear name before you send it, not Final V2 NEW Revised Lastone PDF, but something another person can understand immediately. It might mean adding the information someone will need instead of making them send another email asking for it. It might mean telling a coworker early that you're going to miss a deadline instead of waiting until the deadline arrives. It might mean showing up to a meeting prepared so 10 people don't have to spend 10 minutes waiting for you to find something. Small things, but multiply them across a team, a household, or an entire community, and they matter a lot. Because most frustration in daily life doesn't come from one enormous problem. It comes from hundreds of tiny pieces of unnecessary friction. Someone leaves the shopping cart in the middle of the parking lot. Someone plays a video loudly in a quiet place. Someone doesn't return a shared tool. Someone arrives late without saying anything. Someone leaves a mess because someone else will clean it. Each one is small. But each one transfers a little bit of work, stress, or inconvenience from one person to another. Omoiyari tries to interrupt that transfer. It asks, "Can I handle this small thing now so someone else doesn't have to handle it later?" That's more than politeness. It's a kind of social awareness. And I think one reason this matters so much is that a well-functioning home, workplace, or community can never rely on rules alone. You can write rules for everything. Clean this. Don't leave that there. Be quiet here. Return this when you're finished. Tell people when you're late. But rules only go so far. Eventually, daily life depends on people noticing things for themselves. Someone sees that the trash is full and takes it out. Someone notices a chair is in the way and moves it. Someone sees an elderly person standing and offers a seat. Someone finishes the coffee and starts another pot. Someone wipes a wet bathroom counter instead of leaving it for the next person. Thousands of tiny decisions like that are what make a shared space feel easy to live in. And most of them happen without conversation. That's the deeper lesson of Omoiyari. True consideration often happens before the other person even notices they needed it. You don't wait to hear, "Could you move this?" You notice it's in the way. You don't wait for someone to say, "We're out of this." You notice you used the last one. You don't wait until someone asks why you're late. You send a message before they start wondering. You don't wait until a shared space becomes dirty enough that somebody complains. You clean the small mess you created. That kind of awareness doesn't require money. It doesn't require extra talent. Usually, it doesn't even require much time. It just requires looking one step beyond yourself. And that can be surprisingly difficult because when we're busy, our attention naturally narrows. We think about our schedule, our problem, our destination, our message, our convenience. And sometimes we don't notice that what is convenient for us creates work for somebody else. That's why Omoiyari is a habit. It has to be practiced. A simple question can help. Before leaving a shared space, ask, what am I leaving behind for the next person? Before sending something, ask, have I made this easy to understand? Before making noise, ask, who else has to hear this? Before arriving late, ask, who is now waiting because of me? Before walking away from a small problem, ask, will somebody else have to deal with this because I didn't? These aren't questions meant to make you feel guilty. They're meant to widen your awareness. Because consideration doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for everyone around you. It doesn't mean never inconveniencing anyone. That's impossible. You will be late sometimes. You will forget things. You will make noise. You will leave a mess. You're human. The point is simply to notice more often. And when you notice, take the small action if you can. That's it. So here's the practical challenge for today. Do one useful thing for someone before they ask. It can be almost invisible. Refill something that's running low. Put something back where it belongs. Clean a shared surface. Send information before someone has to request it. Hold the door. Move something out of the way. Tell someone you'll be late before they have to wonder where you are. Don't announce it. Don't wait for credit. Just make one person's day slightly easier. Then notice how small the action was and how much smoother life becomes when people do this for one another. Because that's really what Omoiyari is about. Not grand kindness, not being endlessly selfless, just reducing unnecessary friction between people, one thoughtful action at a time. Gaman teaches us how to carry ourselves when life becomes difficult. Omoiyari teaches us to notice how the way we carry ourselves affects everyone around us. But there is one final Japanese idea we still need to explore. Because even if you improve slowly, find meaning. Learn when enough is enough. Recover your attention. Accept imperfection. Endure difficulty. And think more carefully about others. Life will still break things. Plans fail. Relationships change. People get hurt. We make mistakes. Something that once felt whole can suddenly feel fractured. And the final Japanese principle asks a very different question. Not, how do I hide the damage? But, how do I repair it without pretending it never happened? That idea is called Kintsugi. The eighth and final idea is Kintsugi. And in many ways, this one brings everything we've talked about together. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery. When a bowl or cup breaks, the goal is not always to hide the damage. Instead, the broken pieces are carefully joined again, and the repaired lines are made visible. The object carries the evidence of what happened. It does not pretend it was never broken. And that is what makes Kintsugi such a powerful metaphor for life, because sooner or later, something breaks. A plan you believed in falls apart. A relationship ends. A job disappears. You make a mistake you cannot undo. You fail at something you thought you were ready for. You go through a season that changes you in ways you never expected. And when that happens, most of us have the same instinct. We want to go back to the version of life before the problem, back to the person we were before the disappointment, back to the moment when everything still felt whole. We tell ourselves, I just want things to feel normal again, or I want to get back to who I was. And sometimes that is possible. Sometimes life does return to something familiar, but not always. Some experiences change you permanently, and maybe the goal isn't always to erase that change. Maybe the goal is to decide what you are going to build with it. That's the deeper lesson I take from Kintsugi. Repair does not always restore the original. Sometimes it creates a new version, and that can be difficult to accept, because when we're hurting, the old version feels safer. You remember who you were before the failure, before the loss, before the mistake, before you knew what you know now. That person seems lighter, maybe more confident, maybe less cautious, and it's natural to miss them. But the person who comes after a difficult experience may carry something the earlier version didn't have: better judgment, more humility, clearer boundaries, a stronger sense of what actually matters, more compassion for people going through the same thing, a better understanding of your own limits. Sometimes pain teaches lessons we never would have volunteered to learn. That doesn't mean the pain was good, and it doesn't mean we need to be grateful for everything that hurts us. Some experiences are simply painful. Some losses remain losses. Some mistakes still deserve regret. Kintsugi is not about pretending damage was a gift. It's about asking what can be made from what remains. Imagine losing a job you thought you would keep for years. At first, all you want is your old life back. The routine, the income, the familiar people, the feeling that you knew what tomorrow looked like. But maybe, months later, you realize something. You were more burned out than you admitted. Or the job had become your entire identity. Or you had stopped learning. Or maybe losing it forced you to develop skills you had avoided for years. You would never choose the loss just to learn those lessons. But once the loss has happened, the question changes. Not, how do I pretend this didn't happen? But, what do I know now that I didn't know before? The same thing can happen after a relationship ends. You may spend months trying to become the person you were before it. Then, one day, you realize you don't actually want to go backward. You understand your boundaries better now. You notice warning signs you once ignored. You know what kind of communication you need. You know what you are no longer willing to accept. The relationship ended, but the learning can remain. The repaired life is not the original life, and that does not automatically make it worse. The same applies to failure. Maybe you started a business, and it didn't work. Maybe you failed an exam. Maybe you created something nobody wanted. Maybe you trusted the wrong person. Maybe you made a decision you still wish you could change. Your first instinct may be to hide it, because failure feels embarrassing. We like success stories that move in a straight line. Start here, work hard, win. But real lives rarely look like that. They have wrong turns, delays, bad decisions. Periods when nothing seems to work. And if you remove every failure from someone's story, you often remove the part that taught them how to make the next decision better. The crack becomes information. That's what I think is so powerful about Kintsugi. The repaired line is not pretending to be the untouched surface. It says, something happened here. And the object continues anyway. People can do that too. You don't have to hide every scar. You don't have to turn every painful experience into an inspirational story either. Sometimes you can simply acknowledge, this happened, it changed me, and I am still building. That's enough. Because there is an important difference between being defined by something and being shaped by it. You can be shaped by failure without calling yourself a failure. You can be shaped by loss without allowing loss to become your entire identity. You can learn from a mistake without spending the rest of your life punishing yourself for making it. The experience becomes part of the story, not the whole story. And maybe that's what healing looks like more often than we realize. Not forgetting, not returning, not pretending, integrating, taking what happened and finding a place for it inside a life that continues. Healing isn't always returning to who you were. Sometimes it's learning how to carry what happened without letting it define you. That idea matters because a lot of people spend years waiting to feel like their old self again, after burnout, after grief, after illness, after disappointment, after a major mistake. They keep comparing the person they are now to a version of themselves from before everything changed, and sometimes that comparison keeps them stuck. Maybe the question isn't, when will I become my old self again? Maybe it's, who am I becoming now? That's a different question, and often a more useful one. So here's a reflection worth trying. Think about one difficult experience that changed you. It doesn't have to be the worst thing that ever happened to you, just something that left a mark. Then ask, what did this experience teach me that I probably would not have learned otherwise? Maybe it taught you patience. Maybe it taught you that you can survive uncertainty. Maybe it taught you who actually shows up when life gets difficult. Maybe it taught you to say no. Maybe it taught you that money matters, but peace matters too. Maybe it taught you to stop taking time for granted. Maybe it taught you to ask for help. Maybe it taught you something about yourself that you would rather not have discovered, but needed to know. You don't have to celebrate what happened. Just notice what you carry because of it. That knowledge can become part of the repair, and this is where Kintsugi connects back to everything we've talked about. Kaizen says you can rebuild one small step at a time. Ikigai gives you a reason to continue. Hara Hachi Bu teaches you to recognize enough. Shinrin-yoku reminds you to recover. Wabi-sabi teaches you that not every imperfection needs to disappear. Gaman teaches you how to remain steady through difficulty. Omoiyari reminds you that even while rebuilding yourself, you are still connected to other people. And Kintsugi brings the final lesson. Even when something breaks, the story does not have to end there. You can repair. You can adapt. You can carry the mark without becoming the mark. And maybe you won't return to exactly who you were. Maybe that's okay. Maybe the next version of you will be more careful, more patient, more honest, more compassionate, more aware of what matters. Not because breaking made you better automatically, but because you chose to build something meaningful from what remained. And when we place all 8 of these Japanese ideas together, something becomes clear. They are not 8 random life hacks. They are not 8 tricks for becoming more productive. They are pieces of a larger way of living, a way of improving without rushing, finding meaning without needing to impress, knowing when enough is enough, recovering before exhaustion becomes normal, accepting what doesn't need to be perfect, staying steady when life becomes difficult, thinking beyond yourself, and rebuilding when life doesn't go according to plan. Taken together, they form something much more useful than a list of habits. They form a system for living with intention. So when you step back and look at all 8 of these ideas together, they start to feel less like separate habits and more like different parts of the same way of living. Kaizen says, improve. Not everything at once. Just make one thing a little better than it was yesterday. Ikigai says, find meaning. Know what gives you a reason to get up tomorrow. It doesn't have to be impressive. It just has to matter to you. Hara Hachi Bu says, know when enough is enough. More is not always better. Sometimes the wiser choice is to recognize when you already have what you need. Shinrin-yoku says, recover. Give your attention somewhere quiet to rest. Not every empty moment needs to be filled with information. Wabi-sabi says, accept. Not everything imperfect is broken, and not everything that isn't perfect needs to be fixed. Gaman says, endure. Hard moments will come. Feel them. Take them seriously. But don't let every emotion decide what you do next. Omoiyari says, consider. Look one step beyond yourself. Notice the small inconvenience you can prevent before someone else has to ask. And finally, Kintsugi says, rebuild. When life leaves a crack, you don't always have to erase it. You can learn from it, repair around it, and allow what happened to become part of the person you're becoming. Put those ideas together, and you get something surprisingly simple. Improve. Find meaning. Recognize enough. Recover. Accept. Endure. Consider. Rebuild. None of those requires a perfect life, and none of them requires you to become a completely different person by tomorrow morning. Maybe that's the lesson underneath all 8. The lesson isn't that Japan somehow discovered 8 secret rules that guarantee a better life. Japan has problems, contradictions, and pressures just like anywhere else. The more useful lesson is this: a meaningful life is rarely created through dramatic decisions. More often, it is built through ordinary moments handled with intention. The way you put something back after using it. The moment you decide not to react immediately. The 10 minutes you spend outside without your phone. The small improvement you make to something you do every day. The moment you realize you've had enough. The imperfect thing you decide doesn't need fixing. The difficult experience you choose to learn from instead of hide from. These moments don't feel life-changing when they happen. That's why they're so easy to underestimate. But life is mostly made of ordinary moments. And when the way you handle those moments changes, the direction of your life can slowly change with them. So don't leave this video thinking you need to practice all 8 habits tomorrow. That would miss the point. Instead, ask yourself one question. Which one does my life need most right now? Maybe it's Kaizen, because you've been trying to change too much at once. Maybe it's Ikigai, because your days feel productive but not meaningful. Maybe it's Hara Hachi Bu, because you've forgotten what enough feels like. Maybe your attention is exhausted and you need Shinrin-yoku. Maybe you've been demanding perfection from yourself and need Wabi-sabi. Maybe you're in a difficult season and Gaman is the reminder you need. Maybe you've been so focused on your own problems that Omoiyari could help you look outward again. Or maybe something in your life has broken, and Kintsugi is the idea you need to hear. Choose one, not 8, one, and practice it for the next 7 days. If you choose Kaizen, improve one tiny thing each day. If you choose Ikigai, make time for one thing that gives the day meaning. If you choose Hara Hachi Bu, practice one intentional pause. If you choose Shinrin-yoku, take 10 quiet minutes outside. If you choose Wabi-sabi, let one imperfect thing be good enough. If you choose Gaman, pause before one emotional reaction. If you choose Omoiyari, make one person's day easier before they ask. And if you choose Kintsugi, spend a little time asking what one difficult experience has taught you. 7 days. One principle. That's enough. Because you don't need to rebuild your entire life tomorrow. Improve one action. Notice one moment. Make one better choice. Then repeat it. And repeat it again. Because over a lifetime, tiny choices stop being tiny. They become routines. Routines become character. Character shapes the way you live. And eventually, what looked like a small habit becomes part of the kind of life you've built. A life that is not necessarily perfect. Not always easy. Not free from disappointment, but calmer, more deliberate, more connected, and more intentional. And maybe that's what these Japanese ideas have been pointing toward all along. Not a perfect life, an intentional one. If you enjoy discovering the small Japanese ideas that can make everyday life calmer, simpler, and more intentional, subscribe. Because there is still so much we can learn from the way ordinary life is designed in Japan. And sometimes, the smallest idea is the one that stays with us the longest.